October 1944. Somewhere over the sea beyond sea, a formation of Japanese aircraft flew toward what their commanders believed was a target of opportunity, a window in the American defensive coverage that careful planning and precise timing had identified as exploitable. The formation had been assembled with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that the Imperial military brought to operations it considered decisive, and the men who flew in it had been briefed with the confidence of officers who believed their intelligence picture was accurate and their approach route was clean. They were wrong. 200 miles away, in a darkened compartment aboard an American destroyer escort, a radar operator was watching a scope whose green sweep was already painting the formation's return with a clarity that transformed the Japanese pilot's belief in their concealment into something that would not survive the next 15 minutes. The fighter direction officer leaned over the operator's shoulder, confirmed the contact, reached for his radio, and began vectoring the combat air patrol. The Japanese formation had been invisible to the human eye, to the horizon, to every conventional means of detection that naval warfare had relied upon for centuries. It had not been invisible to the network, and the network, by October 1944, covered the Pacific in ways that the Japanese planning apparatus had not fully mapped and could not quickly counter. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. To understand what the American radar network across the Pacific represented in strategic terms, one must first understand what the Pacific Ocean represented as a tactical problem. It was, by any honest measure, the most demanding environment in which radar had ever been deployed, vast beyond the comprehension of any European frame of reference. Its weather systems generating the atmospheric interference that degraded radar performance in ways that laboratory testing had not fully anticipated. Its distances requiring the kind of network integration that no single installation could accomplish and that demanded the coordination of installations, ships, aircraft, and control systems spread across thousands of miles of ocean and island chain. The radar set itself, the individual transmitter and receiver that sent a pulse of electromagnetic energy into the surrounding air and listened for its return from solid objects, was a mature technology by 1944, its fundamental principles established, its engineering challenges largely solved. What had not been solved in the war's early years was the problem of turning individual radar sets into a coordinated system, of taking the information that each installation produced and combining it in real time into a coherent picture of the airspace and the ocean surface, across an entire theater of operations. The American solution to this problem was not a single technology or a single decision, but an accumulation of engineering, organizational, and tactical development that proceeded through the war's middle years with the organized urgency of a military establishment that had identified the problem clearly and had the industrial and scientific resources to address it comprehensively. The radar sets themselves evolved from the early SC and CXEM sets of 1941 and 1942, which provided basic detection capability at limited range with significant limitations in their ability to determine altitude and resolve closely spaced targets, to the mature SBS and APS series of 1944 and 1945, which offered dramatically improved range, resolution, and the height-finding capability that made effective fighter direction possible. The improvement was not incremental. It was the product of a sustained engineering investment that moved from laboratory prototype to fleet deployment with a speed that reflected both the urgency of the operational requirement and the depth of the industrial and scientific base that American radar development could draw upon. The fighter direction system that translated radar detection into tactical effect was, in some respects, a more significant achievement than the radar sets themselves. Detection without response is information without consequence. The American Combat Information Centers, the CICs that appeared aboard destroyers, cruisers, carriers, and the specialized radar picket ships that ringed American fleet formations by 1944, were the organizational innovation that connected detection to response with the speed and accuracy that modern air combat required. The CIC was a darkened compartment filled with radar displays, radio equipment, plotting tables, and the trained personnel who integrated the information flowing from multiple sources into a continuous, updated picture of the tactical situation. Fighter direction officers working in the CIC could track incoming raids from the moment of first detection, calculate their speed and heading and probable target, determine the intercept geometry, and vector the combat air patrol to the engagement with a precision that transformed the fighter pilot's problem from finding the enemy in a vast sky to arriving at a specific point in that sky at a specific time to meet an enemy whose location was already known. The island radar network that anchored the Pacific system was built on the same engineering foundation as the shipborne installations, but operated on a different scale and with different tactical responsibilities. The radar stations established on the island chains of the Central and Southwestern Pacific, on Guadalcanal, on the Marianas, on the Philippines, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, as it was secured, provided the long-range early warning coverage that gave the fleet and the shore installations the time to respond to incoming raids before they reached their targets. The integration of these shore-based installations with the shipborne systems required communication networks of extraordinary complexity. The radio links and the data transmission protocols and the organizational procedures that allowed a contact detected by shore radar on Saipan to be passed immediately to the fighter direction centers of the fleet operating 300 miles to the west, so that the combat air patrol was already moving toward the intercept before the raid had crossed half the distance to its target. This integration was not seamless in its early implementations. It was developed through the grinding empiricism of operational experience, through the engagements that revealed the gaps, the communication failures, the coordination breakdowns that cost ships and aircraft and lives, and through the systematic revision of procedures and equipment that the American military's capacity for institutional learning allowed it to undertake between one campaign and the next. Japanese commanders who attempted to analyze the American radar network's performance through the latter half of 1944 were working against a fundamental limitation that compounded every other challenge they faced. The network's capabilities could be inferred from operational results, from the consistency with which American combat air patrols arrived at intercept positions that coincided with Japanese raid approaches, from the speed with which American surface formations responded to threats that should have been beyond their detection range, from the pattern of engagements that suggested a level of situational awareness no conventional visual or acoustic detection system could have provided. But the specific parameters of the network, its coverage, its gaps, its integration protocols, its limitations, could not be determined with the precision that effective countermeasures required without a level of technical intelligence that the Japanese signals and electronics establishment was not, by 1944, positioned to develop quickly. They knew the radar existed. They had captured equipment and analyzed it. They understood the basic operating principles. What they could not fully map was the network, the way individual installations connected to each other and to the fleet CICs, the way coverage overlapped to eliminate the gaps that a single installation would have left, the way the system as a whole produced a picture of the battle space that was more complete and more current than the sum of its individual components. The specific engagements of the Philippine Sea Campaign in June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the network's mature capability with a statistical clarity that the operational results made unmistakable. Japanese strike aircraft approaching the American fleet from their carriers to the west were detected at ranges that gave the fighter direction centers aboard the American carriers sufficient time to launch and position the combat air patrol before the raids arrived. The Hellcat pilots who flew those intercepts did not find the enemy by searching a vast sky. They were directed to specific altitudes at specific positions by fighter direction officers working from a radar picture that showed the raid's approach with a precision that made the intercept geometry almost mathematically deterministic. The results reflected this precision. Of the several hundred Japanese aircraft launched in the major strikes of June 19th, the great majority were destroyed before reaching the American fleet, shot down by combat air patrols that had been waiting at the right altitude in the right position because the network had put them there. The psychological impact on Japanese air crews and their commanders accumulated through these engagements into something that the operational reports documented with increasing urgency. Raids that had been planned with the expectation of achieving surprise, that had approached at altitudes and on headings chosen to minimize radar detection and complicate the defenders' response, found American fighters already positioned, already at altitude, already in the engagement geometry that the radar picture had allowed the fighter direction officers to establish before the raid arrived. The surprise was reversed. The attackers, who had expected to find the fleet unprepared, found instead a defensive response so precisely calibrated to their approach that the calibration itself communicated the existence of a detection capability that their planning had not adequately accounted for. The morale effect of consistently finding the enemy prepared, of flying through whatever distance and weather and tactical deception the approach had employed, and arriving at the target to find the combat air patrol already there, already turning into the attack, already knowing where you were and how fast you were coming, was documented by Japanese medical and psychological officers in terms that the clinical language of military medicine approached but could not fully contain. The radar operator's scope, that circular display of glowing green light on which the sweep revealed, with each rotation, the positions of every reflecting object within the set's range, was in its way the most democratic instrument the Pacific War produced. It did not distinguish between the experienced pilot and the novice, between the aircraft with a skilled crew and the one with a frightened one, between the raid that had been planned for weeks and the one improvised under pressure. It simply showed what was there in the positions where it was, at the speeds it was moving. The information it produced was available to anyone trained to read it, and the Americans had trained thousands of people to read it, had industrialized the production of radar operators, fighter direction officers, and CIC personnel with the same organizational thoroughness that they had applied to the production of pilots and mechanics and the aircraft they flew and maintained. The network was not only the equipment, it was the people, the operators and the officers and the controllers who sat in darkened compartments aboard ships and in hardened installations on Pacific islands and maintained the continuous watch that turned the radar's detections into the combat air patrol's intercepts. The coffee thermos that appeared in every CIC aboard every American ship and at every shore installation across the Pacific. That unremarkable container of hot coffee that kept watchstanders alert through the long hours of a night patrol or a fleet transit was in its ordinary way the same argument that every other American logistical abundance had made throughout the war. The network ran continuously because the people running it were sustained continuously, fed, rested in rotation, provided with the equipment they needed to do their work and the coffee that kept them doing it through the hours when doing it was hardest. The Japanese picket boats and shore observation posts that had served as the Imperial Navy's primary early warning system operated under no such sustained provision. By 1944, they were undermanned, under-equipped, and operating in waters where the American submarine and air campaign had made their survival a matter of increasing uncertainty. The asymmetry between the two early warning systems, between the American radar network with its trained personnel and its integrated communications, and its industrial supply chain, and its coffee, and the Japanese coastal observation network with its degraded resources and its isolation and its steadily mounting losses, was a measure of the broader asymmetry between the two nations' capacity to sustain complex military operations across a vast oceanic theater over a period of years. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, the radar picket network had reached a sophistication and an integration that represented the Pacific War's most fully realized expression of a system that American technology, organization, and industrial abundance had been building since 1942. Destroyer escorts stationed on the picket lines around Okinawa provided the earliest warning of the kamikaze raids that represented Japan's final operational concept, the deliberate use of aircraft as guided munitions, piloted by men who had accepted their own deaths as the mission's price. The picket ships paid an extraordinary cost for the warning they provided. They were, by their position on the outer ring of the network, the first targets the kamikazes reached and the losses among. The picket destroyers at Okinawa were among the heaviest of any ship type in the entire Pacific War. But the warning they provided, the radar detections that gave the combat air patrol and the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries the time to respond before the raids reached the carriers and the transports, saved ships and lives in numbers that the losses on the picket line, terrible as they were, did not approach. The network endured. The war ended. And the Japanese commanders who had spent the war's final years attempting to find the gaps in a system whose coverage they could not fully map and whose integration they could not disrupt filed their final reports in the silence of an August that had taken the war away and left behind. In its place, the evidence of what the network had accomplished, the carriers that had survived, the transports that had delivered their troops, the fleet that had remained, engagement after engagement, sufficiently intact to continue the campaign that the network had helped to protect. The radar had not won the war, but it had changed what winning required, had changed the information environment in which every tactical decision was made and every operational plan was executed, until the Pacific Ocean itself had become a space of American awareness and Japanese uncertainty, a battleground that the network had made transparent in one direction and opaque in the other, and in which that asymmetry of knowledge had accumulated, contact by contact and intercept by intercept, into the strategic outcome that September 1945 ratified. Freedom sees further than fear. It always has. It builds the network, trains the operators, sustains the watch, and reads the scope. And what the scope shows, it answers, with the combat air patrol already turning into the intercept, already knowing where you are and how fast you're coming, already there before you arrive, because the network was always watching and the watch was never allowed to sleep. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The men who kept the watch across the Pacific, in darkened sea seas and on radar picket lines, deserve to be remembered. We will keep finding their stories.